It towers over the American Midwest with engineering marvels that boggle the mind and workers willing to risk their lives high in the sky. But awe-inspiring heights are just part of a day in the life of the city of Chicago. There are also stunning waters that lie at its feet, beaches that blanket its shores, and the parks that make Chicagoans proud. There may be no city in America that's had greater comebacks since the day it was founded than Chicago. From the Great Fire that nearly brought it to its knees, to a more than century-long curse that plagued its favorite team. But through it all, the people of Chicago have proven to be some of the toughest on earth. They turn out by the thousands, no matter what the score, and work hard every day to keep their metropolis running 24/7 without a hitch. There's no end to what you can discover when you spend a day in the skies over Chicago. Art that can transport you to the clouds. Train systems that are unlike any other in the world. Even breathtaking colors of water and sky. And every night, this city transforms into a dazzling feast of light. Whether you're peering directly down into its streets or soaring above them high in the sky, it's all possible in just one day in the city of Chicago. There's no better way to kick off a day in the life of Chicago than this. Catching sight of the sun when it first appears over the waters of Lake Michigan. This is the only major American city that towers over the Great Lakes. It's home to more than 2.5 million people, and it serves as the heart of the region known as Chicagoland. That's the name people use to describe the vast metropolitan area that spreads out from the city of Chicago to the north, west, and south. When people say Chicagoland, they're referring to the third largest metro area in the nation after New York and Los Angeles. It covers roughly 11,000 square miles and even extends into southern Wisconsin and northern Indiana. Every morning, hundreds of thousands of commuters from across Chicagoland make their way into the heart of the city. Many get here on Chicago's legendary L trains. Stations like this one in a suburb known as Lakeview are usually packed even before the sun is up. But not everyone in Chicago starts their day with a commute to the office. Especially not these two Chicago twins. For the last 70 years, Jenny and Julia Popoli have been coming down to Chicago's lakeshore for a morning swim in Lake Michigan. By July, the water temperature in the lake is still a chilly 61 degrees. But that doesn't stop the Popolis. As soon as they're in the water, they get into formation and then start their daily 2-mile swim. The twins bought their first bathing suits with pocket money when they were 12, and they have been swimming here almost every year since. They're such a common sight They've been called Legends of the Lake. But when they started their morning ritual, Chicago didn't look anything like this. The tallest building at the time was 44 stories. Since then, the city's skyline has more than doubled in height. By the 1970s, Chicago was home to the tallest building in the world, thanks to the Sears Tower, now known as the Willis Tower. Since 1946, Chicago has gone through 10 colorful mayors and sent a senator to the White House. It was here in a law firm in Chase Tower in 1989 that a young lawyer named Michelle Robinson met Barack Obama. They were later married here on the South Side. And when it was time for Obama to give his election victory speech on November 4th, 2008, he did it here, to an audience of more than 200,000 in Chicago's Grant Park. By the time Michael Jordan was first drafted by the Chicago Bulls, the Popoli twins had already been coming down to Lake Michigan for almost 4 decades. And since Jordan's retirement, they have gone on swimming for nearly 20 more years. But while some Chicagoans start their day in the water, others are already at work high in the sky. Felipe Berman and Efren Salas are 2 of them. By 7 a.m., they are beginning their shifts 1,128 feet above Lake Michigan. They are preparing to do one of the most terrifying jobs in Chicago, washing the windows at the very top of one of the city's tallest skyscrapers. The black tapered tower they're perched on is known as the John Hancock Center. It rises 100 stories over the street, and because of its unique design, all of its windows have to be cleaned individually by hand. There are many skyscrapers in Chicago, but the engineering of the John Hancock Center was revolutionary when it was completed in 1970. At the time, the world's tallest buildings were built around interior cores. But when a structural engineer named Fazlur Khan designed this skyscraper, he came up with an entirely new way to engineer tall buildings. He designed it as a giant tube. The steel beams, or trusses, that are visible on the outside of this tower are actually what hold it up. They've made the John Hancock Center one of the most recognizable skyscrapers in Chicago. Khan has been called the greatest structural engineer of the 20th century, and his tubular designs are now commonly used on super tall buildings around the world. But because the windows of the John Hancock Center lie behind its exterior skeleton, the only way to clean them is the old-fashioned way, one window pane at a time. After their safety checks are done, Felipe and Efren lower themselves over the edge so they can get to work. They'll spend the entire day out here, dropping lower and lower as they squeegee clean 100 stories of glass. Wind and weather can make this job dangerous, but so too can falcons. These birds of prey often nest in the tower's facade and have been known to threaten Felipe and Efren when they get too close. If you look up at the top of Chicago skyscrapers in the morning, chances are you'll see daring workers dangling in thin air. But if you peer up at the highest building in Chicago, you might catch sight of a robot instead. There are 16,100 windows on the Willis Tower, and it takes 6 robotic window washing machines to keep them all clean. Just after dawn, they emerge from their parking garages on the various rooftops of this skyscraper and crawl on tracks slowly to the edge. After a quick inspection by a technician, these machines then deploy down the sides of the building. Steel tracks built into the facade of the Willis Tower are what keep them on course. They only wash on the trip down. Sprayers, squeegees, and vacuums on board clean each window as they pass it by. Robots like these only work on towers with flat facades. Unlike humans, they can do their work in up to 30-mile-per-hour winds, and they're not afraid of heights. After they reach the ground floor, they return automatically to the ledge where they started, so they can be repositioned and then begin cleaning all over again. In 1986, film director John Hughes created what he called a love letter to the city of Chicago. His movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, became a cult classic. It tells the story of a confident young teen played by Matthew Broderick, who skips out of school to spend a day having adventures all across the city and its suburbs. The film doesn't just pay tribute to Chicago, it celebrates all that's possible in this city in just one day. Hughes is said to have based the movie on his own teenage hijinks while he was a student here at Glenbrook North High School in the Chicago suburbs. Today, fans still recreate scenes from the film at many of the locations where they were shot. This set of steps at Glenbrook North High is one of them. In one of the film's most memorable scenes, Ferris rolls up to the front of these steps in his best friend's dad's Ferrari and picks up his girlfriend Sloane right in front of the principal. Thanks to that scene, this is one of the most famous movie locations in Chicagoland. When Ferris, Sloane, and their friend Cameron hit the road and head downtown, they do what many Chicagoans might do if they too could take a day off and spend it however they wanted. After arriving in town, the three friends race up the steps of the Art Institute of Chicago, which lies on the west side of Grant Park. Inside, they contemplate a series of paintings that Hughes himself once admired during his own visits to this museum, a place that he once described as his refuge in the city. Later, the friends take an elevator to the top of the Sears Tower. When the film was shot, this skyscraper was still the tallest building in the world. As they press their faces against the glass, Ferris, Sloane, and Cameron peer down on the streets below. They describe their city as peaceful. It's true that when you look down on Chicago from high above, the noise and bustle of life here often seems to just fade away. And it's possible to discover new worlds that you can't see from the ground. Chicago has 5 million square feet of green space on its rooftops. It blankets more than 350 of its buildings. There are even elaborate rooftop gardens that hover over the streets below. You might never know they exist unless you get up high. But there's one roof in Chicago that's not like the others. This oddly shaped structure, downtown, is the city's Metropolitan Correctional Center. Every morning, prisoners start filling the exercise yard that lies on top of this Chicago skyscraper. It's one of 3 experimental prisons across the country that were built in the 1970s. Architect Harry Weiss designed it as a triangle, so each cell could have its own floor-to-ceiling window. He also turned the prison's roof into an exercise yard. Every other day, prisoners are allowed to spend up to 2 hours here in the open air above their cells. Many of the people doing time in this high-rise jail haven't been convicted of a crime. They are pre-trial detainees, which means they either can't afford or were not given bail as they wait for their next day in court. In 2005, a woman named Piper Kerman was housed here briefly after her conviction for money laundering. Her memoir of life in prison, titled Orange is the New Black, was the inspiration for the popular television series on Netflix. Workers, robots, and prisoners are all used to spending long days up high over the streets of Chicago. But every morning starting at 9 a.m., others pay for a chance to look down on this city from above. They come here to the 94th floor of the John Hancock Center for a ride called Tilt. After shelling out about $25, they step into one of 8 windowed compartments and make sure they're holding on tight. Then, the entire window and floor they're standing on tilts out over the sidewalk, 1,000 feet below. This is how some experience the awe-inspiring engineering of Chicago's skyscrapers. But for others, it's a race to the top of the tallest building in town. Every year, thousands of athletes compete in a race to climb the 2,109 steps that lead from the street to the 103rd floor of the Willis Tower. The best recorded time so far is 13 minutes 9 seconds. From a distance, all the windows of this skyscraper look the same. But up on the 103rd floor, a few stand out. They're actually glass boxes that extend just over 4 feet from the building's facade. They are known as the Ledge. The floors of these 1,500-pound cubes both thrill and terrify. That's because there's nothing under your feet but clear glass and thin air. When you stand on the Ledge, you can see for miles over Illinois' famously flat landscape and look out all across Chicagoland. But you can also look down on the fascinating rail systems that you can only find in Chicago. It's 10:30 a.m. on the south side of Chicago. Here at a station known as Ashland 63rd, L train operator Lachelle Jenkins is just starting her shift. The last stop on her run on this Green Line train will be Harlem Station, west of downtown. Lachelle has been operating L trains for 2 decades. She's responsible for moving hundreds of thousands of passengers a year safely across Chicago. As her train screeches and rumbles through neighborhoods like this one, she has a spectacular front row seat to daily life in this great American city. When author Nelson Algren wrote his famous book about Chicago, he described great trains howling from track to track. If there's any sound that's familiar to Chicagoans on the street, it's the clatter of the L passing overhead. But it's not the only familiar soundtrack to daily life in this city. Chicagoans also know well the sounds of waves and seagulls on the many beaches that line the lake. The sound of wind racing through its urban canyons. And the crack of a bat against a ball at Wrigley Field. But there's one sound that's most often associated with Chicago, especially here on the South Side. And that's the sound of the blues. In 1943, an artist named Muddy Waters arrived in Chicago by train from the Mississippi Delta. He was one of roughly 500,000 African Americans from the South who journeyed north to Chicago during what's known as the Great Migration. They came looking for jobs in steel, meatpacking, and other industries all around the city. By the 1950s, this brick row house here on South Lake Park Avenue was Muddy's home. It was in Chicago that he played the electric guitar for the first time. From his basement studio, he helped forge a new urban blues style that came to be known as Chicago blues. With legendary songs like I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man, Got My Mojo Workin', and Rollin' Stone, Muddy went on to win 9 Grammys and a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Since then, new music legends have risen to fame here on the South Side. This small house on South Shore Drive is easy to miss if you don't know what it is. It was once the childhood home of hip-hop artist Kanye West, who moved to Chicago with his mom from Georgia when he was 3. Kanye never finished college, but his 2004 debut album titled College Dropout went triple platinum. When you speed across Chicago on the L, there's colorful history in just about every neighborhood that passes by, just as there's history on the rails you ride. The Shell's Green Line train runs on the oldest L train tracks in the system. It was on a section of this line that the first L train ever, made of wooden coaches pulled by a steam engine, journeyed across Chicago in 1892. Today, the Green Line is one of 8 different color-coded lines that crisscross the city. What makes Chicago's transit system different from other cities is that 5 of these 8 lines end up running on the same set of tracks when they reach downtown. The reason that the heart of Chicago is known as the Loop is because of this 2-mile circle of elevated train tracks. Only 2 of Chicago's L trains, the blue and red, run in tunnels under the city. Peer down on the Loop from above, and it looks like a carefully choreographed dance of trains below. Hundreds enter and exit the Loop every day. In 1977, a collision on these tracks caused 4 cars of one train to jackknife and then crashed down to the street. 11 people died and 180 were injured. It was later discovered that the operator of one of the trains had used drugs prior to the collision. Today, new safety rules and skilled operators like Lachelle keep the trains and Chicagoans moving safely without a hitch. But Chicago was a railway town long before L trains started making their turns through the Loop. The very first train here, pulled by a steam engine called the Pioneer, headed west out of town in 1848. And Chicago has been a major American rail hub ever since. By 11 a.m., workers and cranes are already busy loading cargo at Chicago's Corwith Rail Yard. Every day, close to 1,300 trains pulling almost 40,000 rail cars roll through Chicagoland. There are 40 rail yards like this one to manage all the traffic. When it was built in 1887, this yard was the largest in the world. For decades, open train cars packed with livestock from as far away as southern Texas arrived here every day to supply Chicago's slaughterhouses. Now, it's impossible to see what kind of freight passes through this city because most of it travels inside long standardized shipping containers. Once trains are loaded, they roll out on the nearly 4,000 miles of railway track that crisscross Chicagoland. Many of the city's oldest rail lines are still in use, but not this one. At least, not by trains. It's 11 a.m. on the 606. That's the name for this elevated part that runs almost 3 miles across the west side of Chicago. In the early 1900s, a train track known as the Bloomingdale Line ran right down the middle of this Chicago street. But that led to fatalities, since trains often appeared suddenly out of nowhere. To keep Chicago residents safe, the Bloomingdale Line was raised above the street in the 1910s. By the 1990s, city planners started imagining how they could repurpose this old train track for public use. That project was named the 606, after the zip code prefix that all Chicagoans share. It took almost 18 years to plan and fund, but in 2015, it finally opened to the public. Since then, the 606 has become one of Chicago's most popular places to walk, run, and bike. it's impossible to imagine a day in the life of Chicago without its trains, and without the vast and stunning waters of Lake Michigan that lie at its feet. When the sun's out, many here flock to this arc of sand known as North Avenue Beach, not far from downtown. If there's one thing that makes Chicagoans particularly proud of their Midwestern city, it's their lakefront. Today, there are at least 24 beaches, big and small, inside the city limits. And where there aren't beaches, there are parks, harbors, and marinas that dot the shoreline, and an 18-mile trail that winds all along the lake. But there was a time when residents of Chicago were fearful of the waters in their rivers and lake. Back in the late 19th century, sewage and industrial waste filled the Chicago River. When it rained, waterborne diseases washed into the lake and poisoned the city's water supply. Cholera epidemics plagued Chicago. To fix the problem, engineers came up with a daring idea. They proposed to permanently reverse the flow of the Chicago River. Instead of dirty river water flowing out into Lake Michigan, fresh, clean lake water would flow in and through the city, cleansing it of pollutants. Pulling it off required one of the largest engineering and excavation projects in the nation's history. A 28-mile channel known as Chicago's Sanitary and Ship Canal. The canal was needed to send water coming from the lake south towards the Mississippi. It took more than 8 years to complete and was such a marvel in its day that Chicagoans often flocked here on the weekends to see this engineering wonder for themselves. The earth-moving techniques developed here were later used to build the Panama Canal. Today, more than a century later, the Chicago River still runs backwards through the city. When the gates open at this massive lock at the mouth of the river, fresh water from Lake Michigan fills up the lock and then flows through Chicago. And Chicagoans aren't taking any chances with their water supply. In 1968, they completed this, the Jardine Water Purification Plant. It's the largest of its kind in the world. It processes up to 1 billion gallons of water a day and is capable of delivering clean drinking water from Lake Michigan to faucets in Chicagoland in just 8 hours. This facility is one of 2 large pieces of land that jut out from Chicago into the lake. The other lies just southeast of downtown. It used to be a busy airport known as Meigs Field. It was beloved by local private pilots since it was so close to town. But in 2003, Chicago Mayor Richard M. Daley decided that he wanted the airport gone to create a new public park. On March 30th, in the dead of night, he ordered an army of bulldozers to gouge giant X's right into the middle of the runway. More than a dozen planes were left stranded on the tarmac. It was the end of Meigs Field and the beginning of a new Chicago park that's known today as Northerly Island. Now, Chicagoans bike and sunbathe right where jets used to make their final approaches into Chicago. Today, Northerly Island looks nearly empty, but that may be because it's almost 1 p.m., and that's kickoff time at nearby Soldier Field, the legendary home of the Chicago Bears. The last time the Bears won the Super Bowl was 1985, but that hasn't dented the enthusiasm that football fans of Chicago have for their hometown team. For hours before the game gets underway, the parking lots that stretch south from Soldier Field fill up with tailgaters. It's one giant orange and blue party. When an icy cold wind blows in from the lake, Bears fans are known to simply button up their coats, put on their hats and gloves, and keep the beer flowing. It's all part of the ritual of getting ready to wage battle at Soldier Field. There are major stadiums all over Chicago, which is evidence of just how important professional sports are to Chicagoans. Just south of downtown lies the home field of the Chicago White Sox. It gets renamed every time a new corporate sponsor pays for naming rights. Many White Sox fans still call it Comiskey Park or the Cell, from the years when it was U.S. Cellular Field. But Chicago's oldest and most treasured stadium lies north of downtown. It's been home to the Chicago Cubs since 1914. Over the years, Chicago has racked up victories in professional football, basketball, and even hockey. But baseball has been a very different story. After winning 2 World Series back-to-back in 1907 and 1908, the Chicago Cubs came up empty for the rest of the 20th century. Many fans believed that their team was cursed by a man with a goat. It all started in 1945 when a local bar owner named William Sianis showed up to a game at Wrigley Field with a live goat, which was the mascot of his Billy Goat Tavern. When the goat was denied entry into the stadium, Sianis is said to have muttered the words, "The Cubs ain't gonna win no more." That was the Billy Goat curse. Sure enough, for years afterwards, the Chicago Cubs had one of the worst records in professional baseball. But the Cubs' most dedicated fans hung in there, game after game, decade after decade, to cheer on their favorite team. Their support finally paid off in 2016, when the Chicago Cubs launched a spectacular comeback and managed to win their first World Series after 108 years. There may be no city in America that's had greater comebacks than Chicago. One reason Chicagoans are proud of their city today is because they know that the richness of daily life here has been hard-earned every step of the way. And every time they see the Chicago Fire Department in action, it's a reminder of Chicago's biggest comeback ever after terrifying events that nearly destroyed it more than a century ago. When you look up at the glimmering skyline of Chicago today, it's hard to imagine that 150 years ago, this city lay in ruins. It all began on October 8th, 1871. Sometime around 8 p.m., a small fire started to burn near a barn at what's now West Tacovin Street. High winds fueled the flames, and flying embers sparked new fires that quickly got out of control. With thousands of structures burning, the flames leapt the Chicago River and forced residents to seek refuge on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was only because of rain 2 days later that the Great Chicago Fire came to an end. But by then, 4 square miles in the heart of the city had been burned to the ground. Nearly 100,000 residents had lost their homes, and almost 300 were dead. The devastation was catastrophic, and many across the country thought Chicago would never recover. But even as the ashes of their houses smoldered, Chicagoans were already back at work, vowing to restore what they had lost and forging a new vision for their city that would make it taller and grander than ever before. Today, Chicago has some of the toughest fire codes in the nation and a fire department that is second to none. They train every day to make sure they're ready for the city's next major blaze. This public housing project, slated for demolition on the south side, is often used as their training ground. But firefighters in Chicago aren't just required to plan for disasters on land. They also serve as first responders on Lake Michigan. Special units on the water train for everything from major fires on cargo ships to boat collisions to drowning victims. And they often coordinate with units on land. In 2016 alone, at least 20 people drowned in Chicago. And the Chicago Tribune has reported that Lake Michigan is the deadliest of the Great Lakes, with as many drownings and water rescues as the 4 other Great Lakes combined since 2010. That's why firefighters have to be prepared to plunge into the lake, even in the dead of winter. Often, life and death in Chicago's waters is decided in a matter of seconds, and by whether the patient can be reached in time and pulled to shore before it's too late. When the clock strikes noon in Chicago, the city often looks like this: a crowded forest of skyscrapers that seem to touch the clouds. But when you get up close, you realize that a vast area of prime real estate in Chicago has barely been built on at all. This is Grant Park, or what many have called Chicago's front yard. When Chicago was incorporated as a city in 1837, a strip of land along Lake Michigan was preserved as public ground. That ground was the origin of Grant Park. After the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, large amounts of debris from the fire were used to expand the park. And over the decades that followed, massive engineering projects extended the Chicago shoreline further out into the lake. But much of the material that was used to develop Chicago's Grant Park actually came from beneath the city itself. Chicago is well known for the trains that run on elevated tracks above its streets. But what many people don't know is that there is an entirely different network of railway lines hidden deep under the city. If you could X-ray Chicago, you'd reveal the bones of a 60-mile tunnel system that lies 40 feet under much of downtown. It was originally built at the turn of the 20th century for telephone cables, but was soon transformed into a complex underground rail system for tiny freight trains. They were often used to remove clay and other debris during the construction of new Chicago buildings. On the southeast side of the city, the tracks ran almost up to the lakefront. Over decades, this freight tunnel system was used to carry landfill to the city's lakeshore. The Field Museum, Soldier Field, and Grant Park were all built on soil that once lay under downtown Chicago. Since its humble origins, Grant Park has grown to cover more than 300 acres. It's now one of the most visited sites in the Midwest. Every year, millions come here to Millennium Park, which lies inside Grant Park, to visit this. It's a giant sculpture that was inspired by the shape and surface of a drop of mercury. It was created in 2006 by an Indian-born British artist named Anish Kapoor. He named his work Cloud Gate, since its shape and surface connects people with the sky. Inside Cloud Gate is an elaborate steel and wooden structure that gives it its shape. But on the surface, 168 stainless steel panels have all been welded together into a seamless skin. What makes it so popular with tourists and Chicagoans alike is the chance to see themselves and Chicago mirrored on its freshly polished surface. When the midday sun shines down on the streets and elevated train tracks of Chicago, workers and others flood out of the city's skyscrapers for their lunch breaks. But when it comes to lunch itself, nothing unites Chicagoans like the humble hot dog. Appreciation for this fast food here can reach an almost religious fervor, which explains why there are 1,800 hot dog vendors in the city alone. One of the most legendary is Byron's. For many, this is like a hot dog shrine. It's been here on the North Side since 1975. There are many different ways to serve hot dogs in Chicago, but Byron's is famous for their Chicago dog. It's prepared simply, with ingredients that include onions, hot peppers, relish, celery salt, tomatoes, and mustard. Some people say that if you put ketchup on a Chicago dog, then you're not a true Chicagoan. To understand how hot dogs got their legendary status in Chicago, all you have to do is journey back to a day in the late 19th century on the city's southwest side. Starting in 1865, the air here was filled with the stench, dust, and haze of stockyards, slaughterhouses, and meat packers. At one time, more than 80% of America's meat was processed in Chicago. Poet Carl Sandburg famously called the city hog butcher for the world. But cattle were also slaughtered here in staggering numbers. This former Union Stockyards gate is one of the only original structures still standing. It was German immigrants who originally gave Chicago the Frankfurter. But it was Chicagoans who turned hot dogs into the now legendary all-beef Chicago dog. Chicago's meat packers were famous for leaving almost no part of an animal wasted, which is how they came to be known as disassembly lines. Legend has it that Henry Ford observed this process here in Chicago and got the idea to reverse it, to make cars. He put the idea to work in Chicago in 1924, when Ford opened a new assembly plant here on Torrance Avenue. When it started operations, it was the second biggest producer of Ford's legendary Model T. Today, more than 4,000 workers in the plant crank out the company's latest models. Every hour, about 58 new cars emerge from this historic facility. Most are Explorers, the company's blockbuster-selling SUV. New Ford vehicles awaiting transport across the nation are parked in lots all around the plant. But a little further to the east, at Chicago's port, is another vast field of cars that's been hidden on purpose from public view. They are evidence of one of the biggest corporate frauds in American history. In 2016, Volkswagen admitted to installing hidden software on close to 500,000 cars in America in order to defeat emissions tests and sell more vehicles. When the company was forced to buy back these defective cars from consumers across Chicagoland, thousands of those vehicles ended up here in this hard-to-spot lot. There's a chance that some of these cars will be fixed and resold, but many will likely end up in the scrapyard. It's 4 p.m. and a Lufthansa cargo jet is making its final approach to runway 10 left at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. This is the third largest airport in the U.S., and it has one of the busiest cargo terminals in the world. But today is not a usual day at this Chicago hub. A team of biologists is suited up and waiting for a very special shipment. Mother and daughter orangutans were about to arrive from a zoo in Hanover, Germany. Here at O'Hare, cargo planes use the airport's longest runways on the south side of the field. Lufthansa's cargo operations in Chicago handle some of the most expensive and exotic shipments on Earth. Whenever they fly, live animals are usually offloaded first. As soon as the forward cargo hatch opens, the mother and daughter orangutans get rolled outside. A cargo lift will deliver them down to the team below. These two great apes made their journey to Chicago in separate specially engineered crates. But holes in the sides allow the mother and daughter to communicate with each other during their flight. Today, orangutans are only found in the wild in Indonesia, and they are highly susceptible to human diseases. That's why everyone on this cargo team has to wear a biohazard suit. Just like millions of other passengers who land at O'Hare every year, these two great apes are just transiting through Chicago. But they are on their way to the Fort Worth Zoo in Texas, which is part of a special international breeding program for orangutans. Now that the mother is safely in the van, her daughter will join her. From O'Hare, their first stop will be the Milwaukee County Zoo, where they'll remain in quarantine for at least 45 days, while vets make sure they are healthy enough to continue on to Texas. It's all just part of a day in the life of the city of Chicago. Back in town, it's almost 6 p.m. And a unique group of urban gardeners is heading out on the North Branch of the Chicago River before the sun sets. This has long been one of the most industrialized and polluted waterways in Chicago. But these kayakers are hoping to change that by using the power of plants. They're building a series of floating gardens along a 2-mile stretch of shore just east of Goose Island. They use only native Illinois species that thrive in wet environments. The idea is that over time, as the plants absorb river water through their roots, they will help cleanse the river of toxins. They're also hoping that the gardens will lure birds, fish, and other creatures to create a new, healthy ecosystem along this stretch of riverfront. Today, they're installing a new bridge to help turtles climb up into the garden from the water. This part of Chicago is changing rapidly. Old industrial buildings are being reborn. Not long ago, people at this cafe looked out on a riverbank of rusted steel. Now, they peer down over a tidy green floating garden. If this pilot project is a success, these gardeners hope to create more green space along this industrial waterway and to take their Chicago experiment to other cities around the world. The waters in and around Chicago can tell many rich tales about daily life in this city, especially the waters of Lake Michigan. On the bed of this lake, just offshore, lie at least 100 aircraft from the days of World War II. They're here because of this, Chicago's Navy Pier. Stretching 3,300 feet out from downtown, this iconic Chicago structure was built in 1914 as part of a master plan for the city's waterfront. It was originally used as a dock for freighters and even has a grand ballroom on its tip. By the 1940s, Navy airmen were using the pier and aircraft carriers that docked here to train for World War II. But during training, 100 Navy planes crashed into the lake, where they still lie today. By the 1970s, this more than half-mile-long structure was falling into disrepair and was ready for a Chicago-style comeback. It was reborn as an entertainment venue and public park that's now the most visited site in the city. And when the sun starts to set over Illinois, Navy Pier transforms into one of Chicago's most dazzling nighttime spectacles. After dark, from above, Chicago is a feast of light. Whether you're soaring past stadiums that rock into the night, vast rail yards that never go to sleep, or it's airports where the lights of passenger jets on approach look like stars descending out of the sky. But when you peer down on the city itself, all you see is a carefully divided grid of rectangles and squares. One mapmaker called Chicago a city that looks like a sheet of graph paper. Up until the early 20th century, this grid was anything but orderly if you were on the street below. There had never been a system in place for giving streets names or numbers, which led to chaos. It was easy to walk the city and get completely lost. But in 1909, the city of Chicago approved a complete makeover of its streets. To do it, planners first picked an intersection at State and Madison in the heart of downtown. Then, starting from this point, they gave all the streets new prefixes based on their direction of travel: east, west, north, or south. Finally, all the houses on these streets got new numbers. Odd numbers for buildings on the south and east sides, even numbers for ones on the north and west. Today, thanks to this urban makeover, Chicago is one of the most easily navigable cities in the world. When you spend a day in the skies over Chicago. This Midwestern metropolis comes alive in surprising ways. Whether it's the robots that polish its tallest towers, the workers who risk their lives up high, or those who brave the freezing waters of the Great Lakes to keep their fellow Chicagoans alive. There's simply no place in America like the city of Chicago.